good evening, everyone. My name's Rosie Goldsmith. Where were you 30 years ago when the Berlin Wall fell? Were you there, perhaps, or watching the extraordinary events on television? Some of you weren't even born. And what must that be like to not have experienced the wall, the GDR, the division of Germany? November 1989 was a time of euphoria and chaos, and Europe, we believed, was free. Now, for me as a BBC journalist and a German graduate, for all of us on the panel tonight, for many of you, our lives were shaped by those events 30 years ago. Now, our dazzling, and I mean that, dazzling, prize-winning authors, novelist Julia Frank and poet and essayist Durs Grünbein were born in the old GDR. Julia in Berlin and Durs in Dresden. Nino Arharachvili, playwright, director, and novelist, author of the epic novel The Eighth Life, which is launched tonight in English, was born in the former Soviet state of Georgia, but moved to Germany in 2003. Karen Lieder, Charlotte Collins, and Ruth Martin are three exceptional Germanists and translators dedicated to promoting the best of German literature in the UK. And they'll be joining us later. Now, when I dreamed up the idea of an evening of riveting German literature, this was my dream guest list. So I'm really, really grateful, and it means an awful lot to me personally that you're all here. Now, over the next 1.5 hours, we have readings and discussion on the state of German prose, poetry, and translation 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, congratulations first and foremost to Nino on the birth of your daughter, who's actually here somewhere, a little baby called Nike, and also on the birth of this magnificent novel, The Eighth Life, for Brilke. Now, it's launched this week in English by Scribe Publications, and thank you to them for everything, and translated by Charlotte Collins and Ruth Martin. Now, 30 years ago, you were a child yourself, not quite a baby, but you are the youngest member of this panel of authors. You were in Georgia. Can you remember anything about that time 30 years ago?
Yes, I mean, I started to go visiting school, and this was a really significant year in Georgia, not only in Berlin, in Germany, because Georgia started proclaiming independency, and riots started also, and people were really, it was strange atmosphere in the air, and just like 1 or 2 years later, it began full chaos. It became so chaotic, and everyone was just like, yeah, the civil wars and economical crisis and all this post-perestroika stuff. But this was a really significant moment because everyone was waiting for something big to happen. And I mean, especially this Berlin Wall, the fall of Berlin Wall was for Georgians kind of, they took it really personally because Shevardnadze was, yes, he was, I think, minister, foreign rights minister, yes. And, but I remember, yes, I remember that for me it was, I wanted to have this cool uniform, the Soviet one. And my parents, I wanted, because I was just like, for me it was a symbol of becoming older and growing up and being able to go to school. And in that year, my parents decided to send me to a really liberal school, anti-Sovietic school, so I was not allowed to wear this uniform, and I was really disappointed. That was...
Yes. So you were 5 or 6 when the Berlin Wall fell, I think? Yeah. I was trying to work it out. 6.
Yeah, 6. Yeah.
And Julia, you were a little bit older. I think you were about 18 or 19 when the Berlin Wall fell. Now, which side of the wall were you on? You were on the west side, weren't you?
I was on the west side in 1989, but since my then boyfriend had been a camera operator for the Spiegel TV, who took the very first pictures when the first people entered the wall and climbed on the wall. I removed every day back and forth between East and West Berlin and joined him doing his work. And of course, since most of my relatives and friends still lived in the East, I was very moved and connected in that times.
But your family had moved out in
78.
78, so they'd actually, in speech marks, emigrated or escaped from the East to the West when you were children.
Well, it was a long process then, because my mother applied for a legal permission, which was hard to get, in 74. And then that was denied, rejected every year. And after 4 years, where she wasn't allowed to work anymore, and we had a lot of spies around us, after 4 years we were able and forced to leave then. So, and we spent almost a year in a refugee camp, which also is one of my protagonists of one of my novels.
Absolutely.
The camp itself is the protagonist.
We'll be hearing a reading from that novel from West later. Now, dears, I don't want to be ageist about these things, but you are the the elder member of the group. So you were in your late 20s when the wall fell,
Yes.
and were you still in Dresden, or had you moved to Berlin?
Yeah, I was 27, and I think that is actually the best age to stand up for your rights and to do something. And that's why I came right in the middle of the whole thing. So I was there at the beginning of the demonstrations in Berlin, the very first day, with some others. But and then from day to day on, it became a bigger mass. And 2 days, 3 days later, I was in prison for that. So that was an experience. Well, situation was that I also had applied for an immigration visa, but I had to wait. And then came these very interesting days where in every part of the country, also in Dresden, in Leipzig, in Berlin, as you know, demonstrations took place.
Now, you had already published one volume of poetry in 1988. Yes. So that was Grauzone am Morgen, Grey Zone in the morning. And so that had been published, as far as I understand, in West Germany.
Yes.
And did this happen quite a lot?
So my book was first there, and later came I. So.
Yeah, so you'd already published. Now, you were a little bit too young to publish. I know you're a bit of a wunderkind, but because you started writing at a very young age, didn't you? Sort of 10 or 11 or something.
Teenage, I guess.
Teenage.
14, but I would never publish this.
You had no.
No.
No, I think certain publishers may say, "Oh, well, we'll take everything you've got in your drawer now." So.
You mentioned something like that, but I refused really strictly because no way.
Julia, had you written anything by then? Were you writing as a child as well?
Of course, I wrote a lot of stories and poems and diaries, but I would not at all, I wouldn't publish any of those. I wrote them partly secretly, but on the other hand, I wrote together with my twin sister, my identical twin and me. We wrote a lot of fantasy and secret stories, which we also played all the time. So we were a little obsessed by all our fantasy worlds.
Now, I stated at the very beginning that the fall of the wall had shaped us all in some way. It definitely shaped my life. And I'm just wondering, is that true for you? Has it shaped your work, your life, your writing? Yes?
Well, you can't go back to that point because it shaped everything, the whole world, Europe and the rest of the world. So every single life was involved by that. And of course, the whole German literature took another way from that moment on. All the books you can imagine, all the poems written from that moment on were different.
What about
So
your
that's the impact of history on anybody's life. Yes.
when did you start writing differently?
Well, I also started very young. I remember writing little stories in an age of about 11 or 12. And I started with prose, for instance. You don't start with poems. So
Don't you?
only came later. No. I started with prose, like little criminal stories, and I used it as a gift in the family. So I started writing poetry when I was 16, 17. And from that moment on, I collected these things, and these were rather observations from my everyday life in that eastern part of the country. And that was actually the first collection with this title, Grey Zone in the Morning. I always say this is a kind of a black and white photography in my own life, because the colors came only later than in the 90s. And seen from now, it's for me it's a very historical thing. So I can do it in an archive, like an old collection of photography. But that was before the wall came down, so...
So when the wall fell, I mean, how quickly did things change as far as literature goes? I mean, there was so much to write about for a start. I mean, you hadn't published. You didn't publish until 1997, I think, the first book. So it took a while for you to digest everything. But then you started writing a lot based on your family story.
Maybe not only my family story, but the later books, also those who are which are translated to English, those have a connection to the historical and the biographical background of my family. But the very first books, I think I rather avoided all those connections to the real history, because it was so close to me. It felt almost like I wouldn't be able to manage, open up what was inside. And I think I really had to get older to write in a certain connection to my biographical experiences. But I remember one thing. I think it was a Heiner Müller's night, and you were taking part. You already had your very first book in West Germany, and I was a student then. I didn't publish then, but I remember that event. It was in the Berliner Ensemble, in the theater.
Yeah, maybe. Yes.
Yeah. So I took part as a visitor, as a reader, as a listener. So.
Well, you don't remember seeing Julia in the audience, but so are you saying that you needed time before you could actually digest and focus and then put into fiction what was going on? What about with poetry, though? I mean, you are a very productive and prolific poet, so you were writing all the time, as Julia says. You were there. I mean, all these people like Heiner Müller and so on too. It was a real ferment of creativity at the time. I remember it myself really well.
Well, because poetry could be everything, could be just some notes, or even a new novel in verse, what I did, could be a concept, could be everything. So it's not unnatural that when you write poetry that you are scribbling every day your ideas in your notebooks. So, but I have a certain idea at the end what a poem then at least should be.
When, I've been looking back for this magazine, looking back over 30 years of German literature, and not just what's been published in English, but generally. And it's incredibly productive time in Germany. And of course, without the fall of the Berlin Wall, there would have been, if you like, less to write about. And I just wonder, has it in some way given you great material to write about? Because however difficult it was, I mean, it doesn't happen to you very often. I mean, the fact that you lived in a country, which suddenly the divide had gone.
Yeah, you can say so. So we are very privileged to have this, as Heiner Müller called it, the material. The material is then suddenly there, and you have a great thing to tell to the rest of the world. So you were amidst a storm in a way. For me, I remember the most important thing of these days were that I could have an idea of what freedom could mean. So I sometimes I said I was greeting freedom from afar. Because it was just a moment in time, just a moment. I should remember that, and also the experience of a total breakdown of a state, of a hierarchy. Never in your life you will experience that again. I'm sure now.
Now, you've lived in Germany for 15, 16 years now, and from what I can see as well, Germans are still dealing with this divide. And in some ways, more than they did maybe 10 years ago. I mean, I've faithfully followed each anniversary and tried to do, events and so on for each anniversary. But I'm just thinking, now it seems to be, there's a lot of discussion about the divide and the continuing divide between the East and the West and dealing with the past. Many people saying that East Germans didn't deal with their past in the same way the West Germans did. There's a lot of really interesting intellectual, historical discussion at the moment. Are you noticing that as a kind of insider, outsider? You live in Berlin, is that right?
No, I do. I live
Hamburg.
in Hamburg. Yes.
Hamburg.
I mean, somehow, unfortunately, yes, I realize these discussions about this right-wing parties becoming more powerful, and it's kind of really an important issue, and somehow it's more focused on Eastern Germany, and everyone is, but it's also, I think, it's a little bit, you have to handle it carefully, because you cannot say it's only just like Eastern German problem. But unfortunately, this is a topic, this is an issue that becomes, and I guess this is also a part of this East-West discussion. But it, how to say it in English, it is an...
Is it in German? There are lots of people here who can
Das
help
rückt
with
in ein
translation.
schlechtes Licht, diese Diskussion.
It pushes it into a negative light.
Yeah.
But do you think there is still, I mean, as far as writing and arts go, do West and East Germans write differently?
I mean, well, what was this parting of a whole country in an East and a West part? I mean, I always try to explain to people, we all have in our countries, we have parliaments. And in the parliaments, you have all these parties from the left wing and to the right wing. So, and there were only some countries in the world who would be divided for the same reason, in a way, just to imagine that. There's no parliament anymore, but the land was cut. I mean, we all know it was the resultant of the Second World War between the Allies, and so, and sometimes I really was very sad about the this, let's say, I didn't do anything for that I was ending up in the East part, because Mr. Stalin has just drawn his line there. Well, but that was the condition I had to grow up with. And
Do you still find it hard?
well, yeah, it puts you, it determines your life too much, I would say.
Still.
And that's one thing I'm fighting against. I'm in a very single position with that, because I always would say, let's say these 40 years, it's chill nothing.
30 years.
No, 40 years
sorry,
of partition, yeah, of GDR.
Yes.
So it's,
So
it's
you
not
don't
defining my, it's not defining my identity, not at all.
So you don't regret the end of the GDR?
No, I don't regret it, of course not.
There are some people who do.
Yeah, no.
And Julia,
Nostalgic
it's a
people.
rhetorical question, but I imagine you don't regret the end of the GDR.
No, I don't regret it, but at least my grandmother, who was born in the western part of Berlin in 1915, which wasn't divided by the Allies then, but even before World War II, but she became a communist, and she was really infected by communism. And even when she lost all her children to the West or to death, she really regretted the fall of the wall, because she just didn't want to give up the idea of another Germany, another Germany which could have fought against the Nazis, in her opinion, since she also was discriminated not only by being communist but also by being Jewish. In her view, in her vision, communistic Germany could fight against all the bad capitalistic Western influences and states and systems, and for her it was really
And
bad.
very truly so. This is the Rosa Luxemburg feeling we still have in history.
Yeah, I mean, she's dead now, but it took her years, and she still suffered the last years of her life. She became over 90 years old. She suffered from the fall of her idea, from her idealism. It was like a religion.
One of the essays we have in the magazine is by a friend of mine called, you might know him, called Michael Hamburger, who was a dramaturg at the Deutsches Theater, and he's now 88. And his mother was the spy Sonja, Ruth Werner. And he writes about her for us in the magazine too. And there is, there is the regret. They went back to the GDR to help build up a socialist society. But anyway, let's talk a little bit more specifically about some of your writing. Let's talk about Nino's book, which is truly amazing, and probably need a few months to discuss this, but we'll do our best in a few minutes. That's the German version, and I'm going to try and lift up with one hand this one here, which is the newly, freshly published English version, The Eighth Life. Now, if somebody doesn't make me some dress material out of that, I'm going to complain, because that is just the most beautiful, beautiful cover. And it's a truth-telling book. Should I give a quick synopsis, or do you want to do that? Do you want to practice giving your synopsis in English?
No, I hate it. I could never never write this, this on the back side of the book. The book is about this and that.
So shall I
completely
do
fail.
it? I've digested
I would be thankful, yes.
Okay. First of all, did you intend to write such a long book?
No.
No.
I wouldn't dare if No, I wanted to write about the 90s. It was a really, really...
The 1990s?
Yeah, because this was the time I grew up. This was after the 98. So, and everything what happened in Georgia, and it was a really, really tough times. Civil wars and economical crisis, and a lot of... the whole world I knew before it crashed down and everything changed, and the society, everything was just like torn apart. So everyone who lived at that time, Georgia, was somehow influenced, or there been impact on them. So I started to think about that, and what I would remember and what was really important or significant. And I realized that it was something like, it was like an ending. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write in German, so nobody will ever read it in Georgia. No, nobody would understand, because it was just like, everybody was fighting against everybody, and nobody, even me, experienced, and with all the knowledge, it was impossible to really understand why things were happening the way they were happening. So I had to do kind of a little time travel. So I went back 80s and 70s, and then I realized that there have been one thing that it really shocked me somehow. I realized that I grew up under Soviet Union, and still, okay, it was like the ending of this regime, but still, I realized that all I knew about the 20th century, it was more from the Western perspective. And it really shocked me because I thought, okay, there's so many questions I have, and there's so many things that I really don't know. So I want to understand, and I become addicted to this. It was like a house, you know, with a lot of doors, and every time when I thought, okay, I opened them all, I've discovered some more. So I couldn't really stop. And then I ended up at the October Revolution, and then I thought, okay.
You did 1917, and then you thought, well, you didn't go further back, though.
No. That was ending point of my research. But you know, because Georgian history from the 20th century, it's so much connected to the Russian one. Exactly. The Russian one is connected, and somehow it became just like bigger and bigger because the material and all the issues and
Stalin. You gave us Stalin. Thank you very much. But so basically, I mean, and you deal with that as well. So just to give you the really quick synopsis, and that's you try to summarize 1,000 pages, but there you are. A monumental family saga which crosses Europe, 6 generations of one family and 8 lives between 1900 and the 2000s. It's set in Georgia, Moscow, London, and Berlin. So it's at a crucial time when Georgia has always been at the crossroads, I suppose, geographical and political crossroads of Europe. But it's a story of revolution. It's a story of the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Iron Curtain, and of perestroika as well. It's all in there. And it's been called a Georgian War and Peace as well, or even Anna Karenina, where women's lives are very central to the story as well, which is why it's an incredibly powerful story. It's told with humor, an exceptional insight into history and politics. It's not just whimsy. This is this is realism as well. Although there is a chocolate coating, there's chocolate all the way through the book, and you'll have to read it to find out. But we're going to have a chocolate reading for you quite soon. But it does not shy away from addressing the atrocities and the individual cruelties of history. Now, to what extent is this novel an attempt to reckon with the past? Which is really part of our theme.
You know, when I started, I didn't have a kind of mission that I wanted to. It was just really an egoistical things that I really wanted to understand. I had a lot of questions about my past and Georgian past. And I mean, it was all related to the Georgian present, because for the last 13 years, it's like a circle. A lot of things are repeating and, yes, going to, it's like, there's so many mistakes that we do again and again and again. And in Georgia, like most of the post-Soviet countries, there have been not such an analyze like in Germany, being like Germans maybe had to, I don't know. And I never understood it, because even in school we were learning for 6 years about the golden era of Georgia and the medieval, like in the 13th century, but it was only one chapter about the Soviet Union. So I thought it's.
And did you come to a conclusion in the end? Did you? I mean, you must have yourself learned so much because you were researching so much, you were writing so much. It must have been an amazing experience for you. And I know that in Georgia, they've published it already in Georgia as well.
Yes, it was a really, really big adventure, and I never thought that when I started that it would become such an important. I mean, it took me 4 years, and I was completely absurd, and the last 2 years I didn't do anything else, and I was traveling around. I had a great scholarship, so I could just like go and doing my research, and most of the time I worked in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I went to a lot of archives, I talked to a lot of people, I made a lot of interviews. I mean, still it's a fiction, it's not a historical book, I'm not a historian, and it's my point of view. It's just like it's.
And you wrote it in German.
Yes,
I mean, had you always spoken German?
I started learn German from really early age, like I don't know, 6 or 7, because I was in a special school with a great German focus. It was founded by some German teachers and so somehow when I came to Germany, I was maybe fluent, but it was more a practical thing because at that period I was studying. I've studied theater directing, and I wanted to stage a play of mine. And I thought, okay, when I write it in Georgia, then I have to translate it on my own because nobody's going to translate it. So I was a little bit too lazy, and then I thought, okay, maybe let's give it a try. Maybe it works out. And I really loved the distance. And because when you write when it's not your mother language, you always have something to discover. Still, I do, and you're so playful. You become more playful with the language because in your mother language you always do things like automatically. You don't question yourself. Why is it this way? Or can I say it maybe in just like other way? And in German, I still have these moments. I mean, I never understood why das Mädchen is, why is this girl, this article thing, because in Georgia we don't even have gender in the language.
Nor
so
I know.
that means still,
I sympathise.
yeah,
Totally.
there's so many so many things that I still discover and keep discovering while writing in that language. So. Somehow.
Well, it is a masterpiece, and I know people are calling it a classic already. So the publishers even gave their staff a day off to read the book. So only a day. I think they should have given them a week off. But I'm looking at the publisher now. But congratulations, really, really amazing.
Thank you.
And we'll talk a little bit more about it. And thank goodness we haven't got lazy translators in this country. Our two translators took quite a long time to translate it as well. We'll hear from them in a minute. Now, Julia's come back to her home, the British Library. The last time we met was the British Library, and we did an event over there. And the last time was actually for the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we'll keep on going until we're in our dotage. But it is wonderful to see you again. And in fact, it's 10 years since this amazing book came out in English. So 2009, Mittagsfrau, I keep forgetting the German title because it's very different from this one, The Blind Side of the Heart in English. And this is my proof copy, which Julia signed the very first time I met her in 2009. So I brought it along as a kind of little moment for us to share. And we've met several times since then. And one of the things that we are very sad about, but also delighted about, is that Julia's translator was Anthea Bell. And so tonight is also, in a way, an homage to Anthea Bell, who translated all three of your extraordinary novels. So, and probably helped to make them a great success in this country. Now, I say you've only got 3 novels in English, but what a for any of us who are in the whole business of translation and so on, that's pretty remarkable. And they are 3 extraordinary novels. So we've got the Mittagsfrau, The Blind Side of the Heart, which was your 4th novel. In reality, that was the first one that was translated. That was 2007 German, won the German Book Prize, and then we had Rücken an Rücken, which is back to back, and that is about the 1950s and the 1960s and the GDR, and then the 1970s Lagerfeuer. Although that was your first book, Lagerfeuer was then translated as West, and that was also made into a film. Now, all these novels, in their various ways, have looked at different decades of German history and of your family history as well. Are you trying to work this out for yourself?
Well, I think I try to write books because of my own interest, because of my own claim and need to do research and to get aware of some stages or segments in our history, but again, it became fictionalized. It all of those three books contain a real nucleus and contain details, especially the very last one, back to back. But they're also fiction in a very in its best meaning, I hope so. But let's get back to Anthea Bell, the very great translator we are honoring tonight. I just learned that she also translated poems of Jos Grünbein. So and
Not poems, but a book of essays.
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 What was the name of the book of essays that she translated? You've written
English
so many,
title.
you probably can't
yeah.
remember. Don't worry.
It's just so amazing, and I really want to thank her, how fine and how brilliant her work is stepping towards the literature she's translating, because she really, in my view, she really knows or knew how to reflect, how to respond to the German language, because either it's poetry or it's essays or it's prose, you really need to figure and to hear the tone of a certain literature, of a book, of dialogues, of characters, of the voice. And well, all of my three books are very differently written in my view. So
Well, they certainly are. I mean, and it's interesting because you write so much about women in yours, and women are absolutely central to your novels as well. And you've got sometimes seemingly quite cruel women, mothers, quite cold, quite cruel.
well, women are not the better people, aren't they? It's not about good and bad. I mean, actually, I met a lot cruel women in my life, and less men, I must say. My whole childhood had been built of women. My whole environment was female. And also the power among women is very strong and very, well, very influencing. So,
But these are women who, in the Blind Side of the Heart, right at the beginning, the mother leaves her son, Peter, so she abandons him. And then in Back to Back, you've got Keta, who is so cruel to her children. She just basically she doesn't even notice they've disappeared when they've gone for 3 days. I mean, she's a tough mother. I mean, I know that she's the communist, she's the GDR artist, the one who wanted to build a happy socialist society, but it seems at the expense of humanity, of human beings.
well, I think that now we really meet the presence, because what we think about mothers today is completely different than motherhood had been 100 years ago or 50 years ago. And I think in her times, Aketa or also Helena wasn't a cruel mother at all. They were just very strong and hard, and fighting for their own surviving and fighting for making a living for their children and themselves. So I think they were trying to solve a life which wasn't made for women staying at home and only caring for their children. And they, of course, they didn't have time to be helicopters for their children at all. And sometimes, of course, they also missed a closer look at their children, or they even miss a relationship to their children.
Tell us about Nellie in West, because we'll be hearing a reading from that quite soon. Yeah. Because that's 1970s. It's about a family who, a woman called Nellie, who's a
she's single mom, though, single mom. And she's a refugee. She comes with her 2 children, and she's one
She's a
of
refugee from East Berlin.
from East Berlin
And she
to
wants to
West
go to
Berlin,
West
and
Berlin.
she now is living in the refugee camp, which I also lived in when I was a child. And she's only one of the 4 characters and voices in the book. So the book is written from 4 different voices, and I think the main protagonist of the book is the camp itself and the isolation, the deprivation that was a theme to me very hard to circle on to focus on, because it's very painful to live in a camp with hundreds of people, very close, very intimate, sharing apartments with another family, with strange people, but having no intimate space, no intimacy at all with each of your, no privacy with any of your most relative people or with anybody. So it's a very, very difficult situation.
Now, when Germany had its more recent refugee crisis, if you like, in 2015, 2016, not a crisis, it became a crisis. Did that also make you think of that time? Were you remembering?
Of course, because I think the life of refugees is, in certain degrees, it really is very similar, since all refugees don't know what they will expect or what they have to go through. They just have visions, they have an utopia inside. Why getting to the West? Why getting up north? Why wanting to go to Europe or to the West? And this utopia is a leading engine inside of all the refugees, but in reality, the chance to really get in contact with the world you are entering is very small, because in the very first month and years, you live in camps, you live among other refugees, and you are not having a work or earning your own money. You are not free at all. You are not independent in any direction. You are very dependent on the help of others. And this is also a very interesting theme also in the book, what it means to be a so-called victim, a refugee, and to be victimized and by the good people who will help you or who want to help you, but also to become good because by helping you. So it's a very complicating situation.
Yeah. Thank you for the moment. Now, dear Scroonbein, before you fall asleep, not at all, not at all. I mean, do you read one another's books, by the way?
What is it?
I'm not going to put. Have you read The Eighth Life? Das achte Leben. Have you read Julia's books?
Yes, I read.
You've read her books.
Textfrau.
You've read, and Julia's read yours, so that's quite good. Yeah, that's
So-
just checking, putting them on the spot there. not very fair. But so, Dios, let's sort of try and describe to people what you've been writing. I mean, you've written 15 collections of poetry, which is quite extraordinary, and hopefully a new anthology coming out in English soon, which is called From a Book of Weaknesses. We hope. Crossing fingers, because there have been several in English. The first was 2005. Michael Hoffman translated, I don't know if you've got this beautiful book, Ashes for Breakfast, which was our first look at that gorgeous book. 2005. This is the first ever Der Scroonbein in English. I read you as a student. I know that's the way it happens, but I just want to tell people a little bit about you, because I remember reading this wonderful phrase that when the wall fell on 1989, this quote from you, and you began traveling the world because you were born in 1962, which is about a year after the Berlin Wall was built. And then your first book of poetry was published in 1988, just the year before the wall fell and had to be smuggled out into the West. And then as soon as the wall fell, you began traveling in what you described, and this is a quote from you, an almost hysterical travel in the interest of making up for lost time. Now, you really haven't stopped moving since then, have you? Are you still making up for lost time by traveling?
Yeah, I tried to stop. So in the last years, I just went back and forth between Berlin and Rome. So Italy is now the other space, so to speak. Well, no, I not only wrote books of poetry, I also wrote a memoir in a way. It's my life in the zoo. It's a title.
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yes.
And it's actually about my childhood and youth in this closed country, closed society, and there are many parts about animals and the situation of animals in the zoo, because I had this idea that we were always visited by Westerners like animals in a zoo. So maybe you remember this situation, right? Well, I would describe my own writing project. It has so many different aspects. It's in the center. There is the poetry, the single line as always the next thought, or a kind of a instrument to explore language and the space and the historical time, of course. But there are other things. So I wrote some opera libretti. I worked for theater, because I think that my poetry writing is very much to do with the drama. So I'm writing mostly in voices, different voices. So there are all kinds of personas speaking. And
Nino, you're in theatre as well, and Julia's involved in visual arts. So it's not as if any of you does one thing. Every life has many aspects.
Well, yeah, it's very important to mention that, because I think that in modern literature, things are very much mixing and mingling. The forms are making metamorphoses in one work. I still don't know this big, very good novel, but I can imagine that you are using also different, let's say, forms of writing. So, what I always let's say I'm always astonished about that. You have a big novel and you open it up and it starts with page first, and there is mostly a poem, right? A quotation from a different poet. So, and then the novel is starting. And I remember that I was doing the same things. I'm going back and forth between prose forms and storytelling, and then I write the next poem. And also a very typical thing for my work of modus operandi, in a way, is to write long essays, which come up then with a short poem, and the other way around. So,
I love what you do. I mean, really, when people say you're a world-class poet, I mean, absolutely, without question. I remember when people called you the poet of United Germany right at the beginning. You were the poet of United Germany, then you were the world poet, then you were whatever. Mm-hmm. We love your poetry. I love your poetry. But this interesting idea again that you always look at history in some way, history and biography. It's always combined. And I remember I was at a German reading of yours in the summer, and they were classical. You were talking about Rome and Greece and so on, but you were actually still relating them to your personal biography and to current events. So you're going back even further and relating and making ancient Rome, Greece part of, our current lives. Well, your life.
There's one thing in poetry you can find. I always call it omnitemporality. temporality, right? So you can switch from one line to the other into an old antique place and come back to Berlin. And so that's very easy possible in writing poetry. That's actually one of the reasons I prefer this form. So to be at the same time in different places and times.
Would you ever write
to
a novel?
be present there.
Would you ever write a novel?
I'm writing novel-like things, but not a novel in a traditional way, so that I would invent like personas or so. It's rather that I always come back to the real history. So even when I wrote this book of my childhood in the GDR, I had to make long excursus to understand what the prehistory of my birthplace was, and to understand actually all the things my family came into.
Let's hear some of the writing now too, because that's a wonderful introduction also to your translator, Karen Lieder, who is herself a specialist in East German literature and has translated several of your poems, and hopefully this this anthology that's coming out. So if our translators could come on the stage as well, if everybody could come up. And we're going to hear readings now from all three authors. Welcome to Karen Lieder.
Vom Erlernen alter Vokabeln. Die Worte schlafen nicht in den Wörterbüchern. Sie ziehen um den Block, ziellos, spielen mit Munition, wie Kinder, die Krieg in sich tragen, lang nach dem Krieg. So hatten wir nicht gewettet, Herr Nobel, dass Dynamit alles austauschbar macht in Materie, Moral, Malerei. Partikel, die seither wild durcheinanderwirbeln, Artikel, in allen Fachzeitschriften für jedes Fach aber Tausende. Eine Wüstenpiste des Wissens und die riesigen Löcher zwischen der und jener Bedeutung von Devotion, die Satellitenbilder von Delirium oder Demokratie. Er war schuld, er hat alles zerstört, dieses Milchgesicht, das den Smog inhalierte und ausblies als Goldstaubdunst. Er war schuld, als er die Morgenröte zum Trödler trug. Diktiert ihr ruhig weiter, Dichter, die Worte schlafen nicht.
On learning old vocabulary. Words don't sleep in dictionaries. They kick about aimlessly on street corners play with munitions, like kids that carry war inside them even when it's done. We never would have guessed, Herr Nobel, that dynamite might make them interchangeable, material, morals, modern art. Particles that went flying from that day, articles in all the scientific journals, thousands per subject, a desert track of knowledge, and the great gulf between this and that meaning of devotion, the satellite pictures of delirium or democracy. Who did this? Who destroyed it all? The baby face that breathed in smog and blew it out as a cloud of gold dust. It's down to him who sold the dawn for scrap. Don't stop the dictation, you poets. Words don't sleep.
And this one leads us to the sea. Any sea coast you can have in mind. Kiosk am Meer. Freiheit und weiter ging der Verkehr. Die Idee hat sich ausgedehnt unterwegs. Am Ende der Mole stand ein Topf aus Beton, keiner wusste wofür. Der Kiosk am Meer, das war sie. Im Fenster hingen blaustichige Ansichtskarten verblichener Sommer. Wie sind wir hierher gekommen? Der Brandung folgend. Wer ist noch derselbe nach Jahren der Egomanie? Über den Wolken schlafen die Mauersegler, so geht die Legende. Aber wie geht sie weiter? Verzeihung, wir kannten uns kaum und die Zeit war kein Eigentum, das der Einzelne schützte wie die Natur. Ist der Sand enttäuscht, wenn die Dämmerung fällt? Wir sprechen, blinzeln, solange wir am Feuer sitzen. Wenn du sie siehst, grüß sie von mir. Sag guten Tag.
Kiosk by the sea. Freedom, and the traffic carried on. The idea had taken hold en route. A tub of concrete stood at the end of the pier, no one knew why. Kiosk by the sea, that was it. In the window, blue-tinged postcards of faded summers. How did we end up here, following the surf? Who can say they are the same after years of egomania? The swifts sleep beyond the clouds, well, that's what the stories say. But what comes next? I'm sorry, we hardly knew one another, and time was not something that we conserved like nature. Is the sun disappointed when evening falls? We talk, blinking as we sit by the fire. If you see it, give it my regards. Say hello.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Des Grunbein and Karen Leder. Thank you, Des, for the moment. And now we've got Julia Frank and Charlotte Collins, and they're going to read from West. And this is Charlotte Collins, who's one of the translators, one of Nino's translators. And Charlotte's kindly going to read the part of Anthea Bell.
Fräulein Senf, wir wissen, in was für einer schrecklichen und ungewohnten Situation Sie hier mit Ihren Kindern leben. Vermutlich empfinden Sie Ihre Umgebung als unwürdig und vielleicht sogar als auswegslos. Nein, keineswegs. Ungewohnt ist sie, aber nicht schrecklich und unwürdig. Ich verschränkte die Arme und verspürte das Fensterbrett in meinem Rücken. Weiter zurückweichen konnte ich nicht. Immerhin, es war meine freie Entscheidung, hierher zu kommen. Was wollen Sie? Keine Angst, Fräulein Senf. Setzen Sie sich doch wieder. Dass Sie misstrauisch sind, kann Ihnen keiner übel nehmen, Fräulein. Nach allem, was Sie durchgemacht haben? Sein Lächeln und die leise Stimme machten mich wahnsinnig. Was ich durchgemacht habe? Werden Sie nicht unverschämt, Herr Rothe?
Fräulein Senf, we know what a dreadful and unusual situation you are living in here with your children. I assume you feel that your surroundings are not worthy of you, perhaps even hopeless. No, I don't. Unusual, yes, but not dreadful and not unworthy of us. I crossed my arms and felt the windowsill behind me. I couldn't retreat any further. Anyway, it was my own decision, freely made, to come here. What do you want? Don't worry, Fräulein Senf. Please, sit down again. No one can blame you for being suspicious, Fräulein, after all that you've been through. His smile and his soft voice were sending me out of my mind. All that I've been through, please don't be impertinent, Herr Rothe. Dr. Rothe, please. Doctor. And I certainly didn't mean to be impertinent, Fräulein Senf. He brought out the word Fräulein like a code or a cover name. Perhaps I'd been credited with the title of Fräulein in the state security files. I was breathing heavily. Too much air had collected in my ribcage and I didn't know what to do with it. On the contrary, we want to help you. He recited his sentence to the end with relish. For a moment, I wondered whether to counter him by saying that he could call me doctor too. But his insistence on the title rendered him ridiculous in my eyes, making him look, with his white hair and the hat that he passed over his knee now and then, and that imperturbable smile on his face, frank and distinguished at the same time, like a child dressed up as an old man. I wasn't going to set my doctorate against his or prolong this conversation by so much as a syllable. I have a check made out to you, a check for a considerable sum of money. He was fidgeting with his hands, and I tried to see if he was still holding the sharp object. Perhaps he'd put it down in the toilet or hidden it ready to use in his waistcoat pocket. And we would like to help you look for an apartment and furnish it. Think of that. We want to help you get on your feet again. May I ask what profession you are practicing? None. Listen, I'm not working. There, you see? Triumph flickered in his small, bright eyes. Degree in chemistry, his file had said. Worked at the Academy of Sciences until April 76. Applied for exit permit, then worked as unskilled labourer in the cemetery. Perhaps we can help you there as well, but do sit down. I don't want your help. Haven't I expressed myself clearly enough? Calm down, Fräulein Senf. Think of your children and the clothes they wear, the food they eat, the address they give when they're asked where they live. I assume you take your maternal responsibility willingly and to the best of your ability. He took another step towards me, and I slid slightly to one side with my back to the windowsill. Don't you think your children feel it's a humiliation to come home through a barrier and go out through it again? Stop going on about my children. My children are none of your business. My own shouting echoed in my ears, but the man didn't seem to be impressed by it. I said, quietly now, what do you know about humiliation? Took a step forward and sat down on the chair, exhausted. Fräulein Senf, it's nearly Christmas. Wouldn't you like to think of celebrating the festive season within your own four walls next year? No, thank you. Please, could you leave now? I'm busy. The book was on the table in front of me. I felt as if years had passed since I put it down there. I opened it and indicated that if he would only leave at last, I was going to go on with reading it. It isn't always easy for people to accept help. There may be reasons for your refusal, Fräulein Senf, and for the pride that finds expression in it. Yet I'm afraid, Fräulein Senf, that you will not change your situation in that way. He walked around behind me with slow steps. We mean well. His hand suddenly shot out and I flinched back, but then he pushed the box of chocolates even closer to me. Wouldn't you like one? I shook my head. With long fingers, he reached neatly for a chocolate and placed it on his tongue. It lay there for a fraction of a second and finally disappeared into his mouth with a plop. He munched slowly and with relish, never taking his eyes off me. The wall and the porter guaranteed our security, they said, yet there were rumors of abductions. Still, how was he going to anesthetize me and then drag me out of the apartment, down the stairs, and past the porter? He perched on the edge of the table as if it were the most natural thing in the world and held the box of chocolates under my nose. Gold foil was dazzling. The bittersweet smell made me retch. Perhaps you'd like to work for us. Think of that. We could get on well together, you and I, he said, smiling. Maybe it was irony that made him smile like that. He took another chocolate from the box, put it on his tongue, and kept his eyes fixed on me.
Bravo. What a fantastic reading. Thank you so much. And speaking of chocolate, we have another chocolate reading for you. We didn't know that was going to happen, but there you are. That's a beautiful reading. Thank you very much. So this is from Nino Harachvili's Das achte Leben, The Eighth Life for Bilka. And may I first of all introduce Ruth Martin, who is the second translator of this. It is so big, it probably needed 10 translators, but it's got 2. Charlotte and Ruth translated this together.
Yeah, it's a short part about chocolate, and chocolate, it's kind of a red line through the whole book, so Ruth will explain it maybe better. Man produzierte paradiesische Torten und Kuchen aller Art, Trüffelschokolade, Bitterschokolade, Vollmilchschokolade mit Aprikosengelee, Walnuss- und Traubensorten, aber auch Exotisches wie Schokoladentat mit schwarzem Pfeffer, Kirschlikörbonbons im Mintschokoladenmantel, Schokoladenkekse mit Feigencremefüllung oder Nougatschokolade mit Wassermelonengelee. Die Schokolaterie vollbrachte es, die französische Patisserie und die österreichische Backtradition mit osteuropäischer Opulenz zu vereinen.
My great-great-grandfather produced divine gateaux and cakes of every description. Truffles, bitter chocolate, milk chocolate with apricot jelly, with walnuts or raisins, and more exotic items like chocolate tarts with black pepper, cherry liqueur centres coated with mint chocolate, chocolate biscuits filled with fig cream, or chocolate nougat with watermelon jelly. The chocolaterie managed to unite the French art of patisserie and traditional Austrian baking with Eastern European opulence. At 6 o'clock every morning, he went to the shop and added his own ingredients to the huge mixtures of chocolate prepared by his employees for each product in his range, giving them their special flavour. Nobody could work out the formula, and it was this that made his chocolate so irresistible. So far, he had only added a very small amount of the special mixture to all his chocolate products, a finishing touch to the flavour, as it were. But it was in the hot chocolate that its magic was at its most potent. Encouraged by the tremendous success of his magic formula, which made him flirt with ambitious plans for expansion, he planned to unveil the crème de la crème of his creation, the hot chocolate, only at the very pinnacle of his fame and success, in Tbilisi, Moscow, or St. Petersburg. It would make everybody swoon. In spite, or perhaps because of his success, the chocolate maker, who was hoping for an heir, had sworn to keep his recipe in the family and to keep it secret for the time being. According to Stasia, this decision saved our family, if not our whole country, from total ruin. Alongside his work, my great-great-grandfather was a freeman of the town and took part in its social and cultural life, moving in elevated circles in local politics. He was also, incidentally, one of the richest inhabitants of the little town, which he wanted to transform into the Nice of the Caucasus, since Tbilisi was already enjoyed a reputation as the Caucasian Paris. His wife cared little for these outward appearances, preferring to occupy her time with Bible study and the strict upbringing of their 2 daughters. Her exaggerated piety vexed him. He sensed that because of it, he'd lost all connection with his children, under the strict eye of their mother and a religious governess, were also growing into pious, timid, un-European girls. The battle on the female front in his own house seemed to be one he was losing, and with grave consequences. He had to have a son. He needed an heir, a man to fight by his side in the battle against the opposite sex. It was a long time since the couple had shared a marital bed, and he knew it would require a lot of time and all his powers of persuasion. The 2 births had been very difficult for Katavan, and she wasn't in the best of health. It wouldn't be easy to convince her to go through another pregnancy. Several times he explained to his wife that it was purely a matter of inheritance because, after all, the chocolate factory needed a male heir. But she remained unimpressed and consoled him with the thought that his 2 daughters would marry, and a shrewd son-in-law was a good alternative solution to the problem. He therefore had to employ other means to convince his wife to bear him a successor. And so he decided to make his finest creation for her, the hot chocolate, because the more concentrated the ingredients, the greater the effect of the recipe. He arranged for a little string quartet to play just for her in the chocolate factory, which was already closed to visitors, and by candlelight, enveloped in the intoxicating aroma of his own concoction, he set in front of her the most beautiful porcelain cup he had been able to find in his shop. Like so many people after her, Katavan was overcome by an unbridled craving for more, and in the days that followed, she begged her husband to make the hot chocolate for her again. And so, my great-great-grandfather was finally able to give her an ultimatum. If she would undergo another pregnancy, he would prepare the hot chocolate for her every day for the following 9 months. Her resistance was broken, and her longing for the most delicious taste in the world gave her no choice but reluctantly to give in and agree to his offer. And so it was that 9 months later, she found herself in labour in her bedroom once again, attended by a country doctor and 2 midwives. It was several hours before they got a healthy, well-formed girl out of her. The mother just gave a disappointed sigh. She thought she'd come through it all successfully until the worried doctor called out that the labourer was still progressing. A second one was on the way. After more pushing and screaming, another girl finally saw the light of day. But the second child refused to cry. Something wasn't right with her lungs, the doctor declared. The child was turning blue, she wasn't getting any air, and he slapped her hard on the back. A few minutes after the birth, the second baby had to be pronounced dead. They had been identical twins. But the first, who was baptized Anastasia, seemed healthy and cheerful and screamed lustily for her mother's milk.
Ruth Martin, Charlotte Collins, and Karen Leader, thank you very much. Amazing readings, just wonderful, really, really wonderful. And tell us about, Nina said it took her 4 years to write. How long did it take you to translate, and how did you do it? 4 years.
On and off, we weren't working on it the whole time, but yeah, it did take a while.
I think it took a little less than 3 years, and there was another year of editing.
I mean, on a serious note, if we look at the books that have been published in English from German over the last few decades, it must be hard when you have a big, fat book like that to find translators and publishers who will take it on, because it's expensive.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, huge credit to Scribe for taking the risk on it and on us.
The man himself in the front row.
Yes.
Brave man.
It's Philip Quinn Jones. I mean, really, wonderful publisher for translated fiction generally. But, I mean, it is difficult, though, for big novel and for poetry to find publishers, German poetry, and, well, not just German poetry, but poetry and big novels like this.
Well, I have to say that when I came to Philip and said, that writer I was telling you about, she's got a new book out, and it's had really good reviews, the first thing he said to me was, how long is it? I said, 1,275 pages. He literally took a step back and went, whoa! I said, no, but it's really, really good. It's really, really good.
I mean, it's rare, isn't it? I mean, I'm trying to think of other, Julia's books are quite long and dense, but not as long as that. I can't think of any. Uwe Tellkamp, Der Turm.
I am actually, and you heard it here first, going to be translating another novel about that length next year.
Really? And what is the title of novel? We heard it here first.
Das kalte Blut by Chris Kraus.
Gosh, that's great. Wow, what are you doing here? We're holding you up. Obviously. So from what you've all been translating over the last, decade or so since you've been, because I mean, it's roughly about that, isn't it, that you've been translating? Because you all had a bit less. You've all been doing other things as well. What kinds of books have been making it into English? What kinds of books have you been translating from Germany?
What kinds of books have been making it into English don't necessarily correspond with the ones I've been doing. I was looking at the German books that have been particularly successful or well received over the last 10 or 15 years, and there's still an awful lot of World War II. I mean, either it's World War II or it's in there somewhere, or Nazis are in there somewhere. I mean, Look Who's Back by Timo Wernes, translated by Jamie Bullock. That was one of the most successful German language books in English in recent years. And although not set in World War II, Hitler does return.
He does appear, yes.
As a talk show host, I
Hans
believe.
Fallada as well. I mean, that was the two novels, which, mind you, they'd been written a long time ago. They were just translated for the first time, published for the first time in English. Can you think of any others that, because you see, they never seemed to become bestsellers, do they?
No, well, I think that's one of the problems, isn't it, for publishers? I remember being at a meeting with the publishers of The Reader in English, and they were saying, Bernhard Schlink's The Reader, that's going to finance all our other publications, they said. All the little ones that don't sell, they're all going to come because of that. And that's the problem. You need the bestseller to finance the more experimental things. I think absolutely the British public still looks for Nazis and sex, preferably combined. But if they're not looking for that, then I think what's interesting about German literature over the last 30 years is it's moved away from that self-examination, actually. We've got a kind of much more multicultural, open, interesting, vibe going on in German literature, and that's beginning to find its way into translation as well. So I personally am very pleased that there are small publishers taking on poetry, for example, new avenues for that opening up all the time, but also, for example, the German-Japanese author Yoko Tawada has found a really strong niche in English literature too, and so I think there is an appetite to look away from the sort of the gazing at the German past, but also to look at other things.
I think some of the most interesting writing that's coming out is from Germans with what they tend to call a migration background, so people who have some other influences coming in, like Nino, like Sasha Stanisic, I can never say his name.
Yes, who's just won the German Book Prize, yes.
And Olga Gryasnova, and Sasha Mariana Salzman. There's a lot of young writers coming through who aren't writing about the war and Nazis, they're writing about other aspects of modern multicultural Germany today, or bringing in their own experience of other countries and of migration, and a lot of that is really interesting.
But if you look at something else that's been really successful this century, Daniel Kahneman's Measuring the World, which is the story of Alexander von Humboldt and Carl Friedrich Gauss, which has no Nazis in it whatsoever, as far as I remember. And you know, there are centuries and centuries of German history, it turns out, and they're all really fascinating. And actually, that's something that I've seen quite a lot of recently, you know, especially in the last couple of years, is historical novels that are set prior to the 20th century.
Karen, you're nodding. I mean, you teach German literature, language, so you're across all of this as well.
Yes. I mean, I think that contemporary literature is something that a lot of the students really want to do, and so I'm very pleased that there is this sort of popularity. There are the big historical novels about science, novels about explorers, yes, and pop literature in German. So it's taking it away.
Graphic novels as well.
Graphic novels, yes.
Germans do wonderful graphic novels. In fact, one of them by Nora Krug, Heimat, I'm reviewing in the German Riveter as well, which is an incredible graphic novel. So yes, lots of different things are happening, but nevertheless, I mean, looking over the publishing figures and so on, you've still got, you know, all the classics, of course, you know, Goethe, Rilke, Brecht, and so on. They're all doing really, really well, thankfully. I mean, but people always say to me, "Where are the new German classics? You know, where are the new German greats?"
Well, you're hearing them tonight.
Well, excluding the German greats we have sitting there. But they do say that, don't they? I mean, that's one of the things, you know, how can you ever match Goethe? Or the same, they say that with Shakespeare in English, I suppose. But
Well, I think it's just going to take a while, isn't it? I mean, that's the point. Shakespeare's had a good long time, and so has Goethe, to creep up on us. And, you know, if we were sitting here in 20 years' time, we might be, you know, picking out other people. But I think I did a radio program not very long about Günter Grass, and there we talked about The Tin Drum as really one of the German books of the century. And I think it just takes a small step of the imagination to look at what we're reading now and really see the ones that are going to last. And there are going to be some great books that come out of the 20th century and the 21st.
Are you, as German speakers, we're all German speakers, and we all learn German at school and university, are you worried about the fact that German is not a popular language anymore? Because, you know, it's shaped our lives, as we've been saying about, you know, this period. German's a very important language to us.
I think it's really worrying. I think the last figure I saw, I can't remember if it's for last year or the year just gone, said that only 3,700 or so people studied German to A-level in the whole of the UK. And then if you think that only a fraction of those people are going to go on to study it at university, it's no wonder that German departments are closing left, right and centre. I mean, if you haven't got the students coming through the school with the language, you're not going to have enough people to fill a department.
As far as translation goes, and German translation, I mean, there are lots of really great German translators. We're blessed in this country with wonderful translators, and you three are, you know, chief amongst them. But I think, you know, there are all kinds of initiatives, aren't there, for German translators? Maybe just talk, you know, to end with a little bit about that. You know, how German translation is being encouraged. And we've got, you know, new books in German and various other wonderful magazines and outlets for reviews, publishers and so on.
Yes, and New Books in German now has a program for emerging translators to encourage more people into the profession and to develop new talent, which I think is wonderful. I mean, the Goethe Institute does so much for translators and translation.
And there are prizes and there are institutions like your own European literature and this German focus. And I think when I was thinking about this, it's the visibility of translation that's changed over the last 30 years. Now it would be almost unthinkable not to have a translator's name on the front of a book, for example. And
Some still do think of not doing
but
it.
but they're pointed out, they're called out for it. And that kind of visibility and the comradeship among young translators especially, I think that's made a real difference to that sort of feeling of it being a craft and an art form and not just a service.
And I think also when you're talking about initiatives and so on to help translators get started, I mean, for both of us, the Emerging Translators Network, which you're well aware of, which started in about 2011, it's now got
over 1,000 members.
over 1,000, is over 1,000.
You can be able to see all of these articles, one after another, online on our website, the European Literature Network. And I think I've probably thanked everybody. I want to thank the British Library, of course, for creating this space for us, because in fact, this space didn't exist as this. So we're really grateful to Jean-Philippe and his team as well for this wonderful evening. So thank you to Dirk Grunbein, to Julia Frank, to Ruth Martin, to Charlotte Collins, to Karen Lieder, and where is Nino? I think Nino's feeding her baby, and to Nino Harachvili. And finally, over to Karen Lieder, who's going to read to us from the Doctrine of Photography.
Die Lehre der Fotografie. Die Stadt, in der ich aufwuchs, war keine westliche Stadt, sie war keine östliche Stadt. Nördlich von Böhmen lag sie, südlich von Grönland unter der Sandsteinschweiz, in einem Flusstal von Wiesengrün. Sie war das Nest in der Mitte, der Rest einer schönen steinernen Geste, eine Suite im Hotel Alt-Europa.
The Doctrine of Photography. The city where I grew up was not a western city nor an eastern city. It lay north of Bohemia, south of Greenland, under the sandstone Switzerland, in a river valley, green with fields. It was the dump in the middle, the rump of an exquisite gesture in stone, a suite in Hotel Old Europe. Stuck under layers of wallpaper, newspapers from a world gone by. Reports of Zeppelin flights, League of Nations conferences, miscellaneous alongside adverts for brassieres and ironing boards. But the view to the river was blocked with grey barracks, and the southern wing and the northern wing, broken like the Baroque palace, furnishings given for junk. All of it somehow stranded, the steamers and churches, the domes, and not much life in the bar. But then I found it one day, down on the banks, under rusty nails, heaps of nuts and bolts from machines dismantled long ago, factories expropriated, torn down. I found it amongst the bones unearthed by scavenging dogs, ribs and vertebrae, splinters of human and beast, so it seemed, the key to the city, and found a kind of peace and knew where I was from and where I came from. Until I saw the photographs, not the ones at home in the album, but those for sale on street market stalls, archive pictures, postcards of street scenes, city views from between the wars, moments from a life gone by, some still with a stamp, original print by hand. Past the house fronts, all still intact, over the bridges, the broad terraces along the Königsufer, the banks of the Elbe, people walking, all dead now, but the youngest in their prams. Mothers in dark coats and hats, chained for all time to this or that man with a briefcase. On a traffic island, a boy in lederhosen who would never age, staring from the poster for Rieke cocoa chocolate. Auersberg ladies wear, Wilsdrufer Straße, the new bathing costume from Alsberg, and the beauty in silk stockings getting out of the tram, number 11, picked out by chance, and her too, fixed in that spot forever. All of them passers by in time, the girl at the flower market stall on Altmarkt, the one by the striped awnings on Prager Straße, at the station, the clock, forever, at 10:30.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. Thank you, Durs. Absolutely beautiful poem. And that's hopefully going to be in the new anthology, I should think, as well. Thank you, everyone, very, very much indeed. Thank you.